My brother dropped our dad on my front porch at 7:12 on a Saturday morning with one suitcase, a grocery bag full of prescription bottles, and absolutely no warning. I was standing in my kitchen in socks, waiting for coffee to finish brewing, when I heard a car door slam outside. Then another one. By the time I reached the front window, Kevin was already pulling Dad's old blue suitcase out of the back of his SUV. Dad stood on the sidewalk beside him, wearing his brown canvas coat, even though it was barely 40 degrees outside. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically exactly. More like somebody had turned the volume down on him. I opened the front door. Ken? He didn't say good morning. He dragged the suitcase up my walkway, set it beside me, and handed me the grocery bag. Your turn. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your brain hears something so ridiculous that it tries humor before it tries anger. My what? Dad. Dining. He pointed toward our father like he was pointing out a package he'd just delivered. I've had him since April. I can't do it anymore. Dad stared at the concrete. I looked at Kevin. You've had him? You know what I mean. No. I really don't. Kevin rubbed both hands over his face. He looked exhausted, and for half a second, that slowed me down. My brother had always been good at looking like the person something was happening to, even when he was the one making it happen. I need a break, Allie. That sounds like something you call me about before 7 in the morning. Yeah. I did call. You texted me at 11:30 last night and said, "You home tomorrow?" Well, you were. I just stared at him. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. Please don't make this harder than it already is. That sentence mattered. I just didn't know how much yet. Dad finally looked up. I can go to a hotel. That was the first thing he'd said. And I hated the way he said it. Not offended. Not angry. Embarrassed. Like being 75 years old and standing on your daughter's porch with your belongings in one suitcase was somehow a social mistake he had made. I stepped aside. Dad, get inside. Kevin exhaled like I'd just approved something. I caught his arm before he turned away. What happened? Nothing happened. You're dropping Dad at my house with one suitcase. He's fine. If he's fine, why are you dropping him here? Kevin glanced toward the open doorway. Dad had already disappeared inside. Then Kevin said, I just need a few weeks. A few weeks for what? I don't know. To get my life back. There it was. And the crazy part is, I almost felt guilty. That's how trained I was. Kevin looked tired. So somewhere inside me a little switch flipped automatically. What can I do to make this easier? I'd been doing that my whole life. Before I could ask anything else, Kevin got back into his SUV. His doctor's stuff is in the bag. What doctor's stuff? His meds. Which medications? It's labeled. Kevin. He started the engine. Call me later. Then he rolled the window down about 6 inches. Oh, and don't pile on, okay? He's already upset. He drove away. I stood there in the cold, holding a grocery bag full of medication bottles. Don't pile on. That was our family's favorite sentence. Nobody had it embroidered on a pillow, but they might as well have. When Kevin failed freshman year of college, Mom told me not to pile on. When Kevin borrowed Dad's truck and returned it with the passenger door crushed in, I was told not to pile on. When he got divorced, lost his house, moved in with Dad, and somehow transformed himself from a 48-year-old man with 3 failed businesses into the family tragedy everybody needed to protect? Definitely don't pile on. I was the opposite. Nobody worried about piling on me, because apparently I came with load-bearing walls. If you've ever been the person in your family everybody calls the capable one, you probably already know where this is going. Except I didn't. Because at that moment, I thought my brother had simply gotten tired of taking care of our father. Then, about 20 minutes later, I reached into Dad's coat, looking for his wallet. And I found the folder. It was a plain manila folder, bent at one corner, tucked inside the inner pocket. My name was written across the front in Dad's blocky handwriting. Understanding couple one. Underneath that, he had written, "Oh, don't call Kevin until you read this." I looked toward the living room. Dad was sitting on the edge of my couch with both hands wrapped around the coffee mug I'd given him. He wasn't drinking it. "Dad?" He didn't turn around. I held up the folder. "What is this?" His shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just about half an inch. And somehow that scared me more than if he'd started crying. "Read it first," he said. "Read what?" "Just read it." So I did. And that was the moment I realized Kevin hadn't dropped Dad at my house because he needed a break. He'd dropped him there because something had finally stopped working. I'm 46 years old, and I manage commercial construction projects around Boise. Hi. Office buildings, medical clinics, retail, renovations. Nothing glamorous, but I'm good at it. My job is basically noticing when somebody says, "Everything's fine," while standing next to a wall that is very clearly leaning. I deal in schedules, invoices, subcontractors, missed deadlines, change orders, and people explaining why the thing they promised me in writing somehow no longer means what it meant when they wrote it. So when I opened that folder, I didn't understand the story immediately, but I understood that the numbers didn't agree with each other. The first page was a bank statement. Dad's checking account. There was a highlighted transfer for $1,800. Kevin Bennett. The next month, same thing. $1,800. The next month, $2,000. Then, $2,400. Then, another, $1,800. I flipped to the next page. A credit card statement. Truck tires. $684. Kevin's truck. I knew because I'd helped him find those tires online 3 months earlier when he called complaining that the dealership price was ridiculous. Another statement. A payment to an equipment rental company. Another. A business insurance premium. Then a receipt from a roofing contractor for $18,400. That stopped me. I knew that roof. I'd paid for that roof. Dad had called me 9 months earlier and said there was water coming through the ceiling in the upstairs hallway. I'd gone over there myself. I'd gotten 3 quotes. I'd negotiated the price. And because Dad kept saying retirement had gotten tighter than he expected, I'd paid the contractor directly. $18,400. The same invoice was sitting in the folder. Stamped paid. Next to it was a copy of Dad's bank statement from the same week. There was no $18,000 payment to the roofer. There was, however, a $12,000 transfer to Kevin. I went back to the first page. Then the second. Then the roof invoice again. If you've ever worked construction, you learn not to accuse anybody before you know where the money went. People make mistakes. Invoices get duplicated. Transfers get labeled strangely. And there are explanations. So I kept reading. There was a county tax notice. Dad had told me in February that his property taxes had jumped and he was short. I had sent him $4,800. 2 days after my transfer reached his account, $3,500 went to Kevin. There was a handwritten note clipped behind it. This one was Dad's. April 8, Darf. That told Allie taxes were short. Gave K 3,500. Said it was last time. April 22nd. K needed insurance. May 3rd. K said account overdrawn. May 9. Told him no. May 10. Gave 12,000. Gave 12,200. I sat down at my kitchen table. The coffee maker clicked off behind me. There were 11 pages left. By page 6, my hands had gone cold. Dad had been giving Kevin money for years. Not months. Years. Some of it was obvious. Some of it I already knew. Dad had helped Kevin after the divorce. Everybody knew that. Kevin's wife, Melissa, had left 3 years earlier after what Kevin described as a rough patch, which is the kind of phrase my brother uses when the truth contains too many verbs. He'd moved back into Dad's house temporarily. Then he started helping Dad with groceries, yard work, doctor appointments, and maintenance. Everybody praised him for it, especially Dad. My son gave up his privacy to help me. He used to tell people. I believed that story too. Actually, I defended it. More than once. When one of my cousins made a comment about Kevin living rent-free, I said, "He does a lot for Dad." Because he did. At least, I thought he did. The folder suggested something different. Dad had been paying Kevin every month. Not just covering expenses. Paying him. And whenever Kevin needed more, Dad gave him more. When Dad ran short, he called me. That was the part that took longer to land. I hadn't been helping Dad. Not entirely. I had been replenishing the account Kevin was draining. I walked into the living room, holding the folder. Dad still hadn't touched his coffee. I sat in the chair across from him. How long? He stared at the mug. Depends what you're asking. That's not a promising start. He gave a tiny smile. That irritated me more than it should have. How long have you been giving Kevin money? Not a while. How long? Since before he moved in. How long, Dad? He finally looked at me. Maybe 5 years. 5 years. My mother died 8 years ago. For the first 3 years after that, Dad managed fine. Then he started having unexpected expenses. A new water heater. Dental work. Property taxes. Car repairs. A furnace. Tree removal. Insurance. Every few months there was something. And I paid because I could. That mattered in our family. I could. Kevin couldn't. Dad used to say it. Like that settled everything. Allie's doing fine. That sentence followed me through adulthood like a permission slip. Kevin needs $10,000. Allie's doing fine. That's it. Mom needs someone to take her to treatment twice a week. Allie's schedule is flexible. Dad needs new gutters. Allie knows contractors. Christmas dinner needs organizing. Allie's good at that stuff. Kevin is having a hard year? Don't pile on. I wasn't angry that I had helped my parents. I want to be clear about that. My mother died of cancer. There isn't a single hospital drive, grocery run, prescription pickup, or night on their couch that I regret. What made me sick was realizing some of the help I thought I was giving, Dad had been redirected. Not accidentally. Ow. Quietly. Why? I asked. Dad rubbed one thumb against the handle of his mug. You know your brother. No, apparently I don't. He's had some bad luck. 5 years of it? Allie. Tor. No. Explain it. Dad sighed. After the divorce, He was in a bad place. Okay. He was embarrassed. Okay. He was trying to rebuild with your money. He's my son. So am I. He closed his eyes. That's not what I meant. I know exactly what you meant. He put the mug on my coffee table. Then he said the sentence that explained almost my entire childhood. You never needed what he needed. I didn't say anything. Dad kept going. You were always okay. It was almost fascinating hearing it out loud. Not because I hadn't heard versions of it before. Because I had. My whole life. When Kevin needed tutoring, Mom paid for tutoring. When I wanted art lessons, they said I was already good at art. When Kevin totaled his first car, Dad helped him replace it. When mine died halfway through college, I took the bus until I saved enough for another one. When Kevin struggled at work, Dad made calls. When I got laid off at 32, I didn't tell anybody for 6 weeks because I knew what they would say. You'll figure it out. And I did. That was the trap. Every time I survived without help, my family treated it as proof that I had never needed any. I wish I could tell you I stood up right then and delivered some incredible speech. I didn't. I asked if Dad wanted eggs. That's what I did. I stood in my kitchen making scrambled eggs for the man who had just admitted he'd been lying to me about money for years. Because being useful was where I went when I didn't know what to feel. Dad stayed at my house that weekend. Then, Monday. Then Tuesday. Kevin didn't call. Not once. I texted him Sunday night. We need to talk about Dad's plan. He responded 20 minutes later. Can't tonight. Monday morning? I tried again. When are you taking him back? Kevin wrote. We need to share responsibility. I stared at that message so long my phone screen went dark. Share responsibility. And Siri. That was rich, but I still didn't confront him about the folder. Dad had asked me not to. And even after everything I'd just learned, part of me was still obeying. That first week taught me something else. Dad didn't need the level of care Kevin had claimed he did. He needed help. Absolutely. His knees were bad. Setting, Kieran. He got tired quickly. And in seaweed had surely the light. How she is to the sea steps. He'd had a couple of dizzy spells that his doctor was already aware of. He wasn't driving much anymore because he didn't trust himself at night. But he could shower. Hell. Dress himself. Make breakfast. Use his phone. Take his medications if they were organized. He didn't need somebody sitting beside him 24 hours a day. Kevin had talked about caring for Dad like he'd spent 6 months carrying him uphill. By Wednesday, Dad had made himself oatmeal, unloaded my dishwasher, and called his pharmacy without asking me for help. I came home from work Thursday and found him at my dining table with a small plastic bag of receipts. What are you doing? Trying to see what I spent last month. That was when I noticed the yellow legal pad. Numbers. Dates. Little notes. Kevin. Gas. Kevin. Phone. Kevin. Truck. Kevin. Cash. I put my purse down. Dad. Dad. He covered the page with his hand. Not quickly. Instinctively. Like a kid getting caught cheating on homework. How much? I don't know. Yes, you do. He looked away. I pulled out the chair across from him. How much money have you given Kevin? All together? Yes. I don't know all together. Ballpark. Alley. Dad? He rubbed his forehead. Maybe 80. 80. What? He didn't answer. I actually said 80 hundred? I knew how stupid that sounded. I wanted it to be 8,000. Dad whispered, thousand, $80,000. And that wasn't counting the free housing, or groceries, or utilities, or whatever I didn't know about yet. I sat back. You gave Kevin $80,000? Over years. That doesn't make it better. I didn't say it did. Where'd you get $80,000? Dad stared at the legal pad. And right there, I saw something change in his face. That was my first warning that the folder wasn't the worst part. He said, some savings. Some. A loan. I stopped. What loan? He wouldn't look at me. Dad. Against the house. I felt my stomach tighten. How much? 65. 65,000. He nodded. When? Last year. You told me the house was paid off. It was. The room felt weirdly quiet. Not movie quiet. Real quiet. Refrigerator humming. Neighbors' dog barking outside. The heating vent rattling because I'd been meaning to tighten it for 3 months. I looked at Dad and suddenly remembered a conversation from last summer. He'd called me while I was driving home from a job site. He said the house needed exterior paint and the deck railing was unsafe. I told him I'd come look. He said, no rush. I just hate asking you for things. I felt guilty. Of course I did. 2 weeks later, I paid a contractor $3,100 to repair the railing and repaint the worst section. Meanwhile, Dad had borrowed $65,000 against the house. That money wasn't for him. It was for Kevin. What did Kevin need $65,000 for? It wasn't all at once. Dad. He was trying to get the business going. Kevin's latest business was a mobile detailing company. Before that, it was custom storage sheds. Before that, online sporting goods. Before that, something involving vending machines that none of us fully understood. My brother calls himself self-employed. The rest of us have mostly been the employed part. Ein schönes Jahr Sie. Our betrayal. And also a child. I sometimes to see you. Does he know you borrowed against the house? Dad nodded. Did he ask you to? Silence. Dad, die. He said he could pay it back. I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because, apparently, I hadn't learned my lesson from the front porch. How much has he paid back? Dad looked at the table. Some. Oh. How much? About $3,800. Out of $65,000. I stood up and walked into the kitchen. Dad called my name. I turned around. Did you tell Kevin I paid for the roof? He looked confused. What? The roof. Did he know I paid for it? Yes. Did he know I sent you money for taxes? Dad didn't answer. Did he know you were calling me for money? Allie, I wasn't trying to... Did he know? Yes. That one hurt. More than the loan. Because Kevin knew. Every time he thanked me for helping Dad. Every time he joked that I was the rich sibling. Every time he stood in Dad's kitchen while I paid for something. He knew. And Dad knew he knew. It wasn't one person lying. It was a system. I went upstairs and closed my bedroom door. Then I cried. I cried quietly, which annoyed me afterward. Because even alone in my own house, apparently, I was still trying not to make trouble. The next morning, I went to work. I had a project meeting at 8:30 about a medical office renovation that was running 11 days behind. The electrician blamed the drywall crew. The drywall crew blamed a permit delay. The superintendent blamed everybody. I sat there listening to grown adults explain why a timeline no longer meant what it said, and something clicked. At work, whenever a project goes bad, you don't ask who sounds most convincing. You build the timeline. Dates don't care who the favorite child is. So that night, I started one. Not a dramatic binder. Not some detective wall with red string. A spreadsheet. Because, apparently, my midlife rebellion involves conditional formatting. I pulled my bank records for the previous 5 years. Every transfer to Dad. Every contractor payment. Every bill I'd covered. I matched those dates against the statements from his folder. Then I asked Dad for the rest. He resisted. For 2 days. Then on Sunday morning, he came downstairs carrying a small cardboard document box. He set it beside my laptop. I should have told you. That was all he said. Inside were old statements, tax notices, invoices, and mail from the lender. I spent 6 hours going through them. The pattern was worse than I expected. In March 2 years earlier, Dad called me because the furnace needed replacing. I paid $6,200. 4 days later, he gave Kevin $5,000. That October, Dad told me he had an expensive dental procedure. I sent $3,000. His insurance had actually covered most of it. $2,500 went to Kevin. The following February, Dad asked for help with property taxes. I sent $4,800. $3,500 went to Kevin. Then there were smaller things. $500, $800, $1,200. A truck payment, insurance, business registration. Shop key, tools, electric bill, and the regular monthly transfers. By the end, I calculated that I had personally sent or spent a little over $57,000, helping Dad in 5 years. Dad had given Kevin more than $94,000 during roughly the same period. Some of that came from his own pension and savings. Some came from the loan. And some of it existed because I was covering expenses Dad would otherwise have needed to pay himself. That was the second betrayal. The first betrayal was Kevin taking advantage. The second was understanding that Dad had actively helped him do it. I walked into the living room with my laptop. Dad was watching college football with the volume low. I figured it out. He muted the television. I sat down. You weren't running out of money. He looked at me. You were moving it. Allie. No. Listen. I turned the laptop around. When you asked me for the furnace, you'd just given Kevin $5,000. When you asked me for the taxes, same thing. When I paid the roof, you transferred $12,000 to him. I know. You knew I would help. He didn't answer. You knew I wouldn't ask too many questions because you were my dad. His face changed. That one got through. I never thought of it like that. Well, I did. I didn't want you paying Kevin. But I was. Not directly. I stared at him. Dad, money doesn't care which door it came through. He looked down. I kept my voice calm. That's something I'm good at. People mistake calm women for women who aren't angry. Those are not the same thing. You protected Kevin's pride with my trust. Dad swallowed. I thought I was helping both of you. I almost laughed. How were you helping me? You were doing well. That's not help. I was proud of you. That's also not help. I didn't want to bother you. You called me every time you needed money. He flinched. I immediately felt bad. There it was again. That reflex. I had to physically stop myself from apologizing. Dad rubbed both palms down his thighs. Your brother was struggling. And I wasn't allowed to? He looked confused. I said it again. When exactly was I allowed to struggle? Allie, come on. No, think about it. I know you've had hard times. Do you? He opened his mouth, closed it. When I got laid off 12 years ago, did you know? You found another job. 6 weeks later. I knew it was something like that. Did you call? I'm sure I did. You didn't. His face fell. I didn't tell you because Mom was sick, and Kevin was separating from Melissa, and everybody already had something going on. I could hear the family phrase forming before he said it. I didn't want to pile on. Dad looked at me. There it was. The whole thing. I laughed. But this time it came out ugly. Exactly. He turned the television off. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. For 30 years, everybody in this family has been trying not to pile on Kevin. You know where all that white went? Dad didn't answer. I tapped my chest. Here, tea. He looked away. I said, and the wild part is you all complimented me for carrying it. That conversation didn't fix anything. Real conversations usually don't. Dad cried later. So did I. He apologized, then defended himself. Ew. Then apologized for defending himself. Then explained Kevin's divorce. Then admitted Kevin had manipulated him. Then admitted he'd manipulated me. Then said he hated that word. I told him I wasn't crazy about it either. For a week we moved back and forth like that. Progress. Defensiveness. Silence. Honesty. Guilt. Guilt. Repeat. Kevin still hadn't come over. He called Dad every couple of days, but only when I wasn't in the room. Then one Thursday evening, my phone rang. Kevin. I let it ring twice before answering. Hey. He skipped hello. How long is Dad planning to stay there? I almost admired the question. You dropped him here. I know. So why are you asking me? Because he keeps saying you're working on some plan. We are. What plan? A plan that doesn't involve dumping him on somebody's porch. He sighed. Allie, can we not do this? Do what? Turn everything into some moral indictment. I smiled. My brother has always used $5 words when $1 words might make him responsible. Okay, why did you bring Dad here? I told you. I needed a break. From what? Taking care of him. What care were you providing? He went quiet. Then he laughed. You serious? Completely. I cook. I drive him places. I'm there if something happens. Dad cooks. Sometimes. He schedules his own appointments. Not always. He orders groceries. Because I showed him how. You live in his house for free. That changed the temperature. There it is. There, what is? You've always hated that. I've never cared that you lived there. Yeah, right. I cared when you acted like living there was a charitable donation. He raised his voice. You have no idea what the last 6 months have been like. You're right. That was important. I didn't want to become so angry that I became dishonest. I don't know everything you did for Dad. I'm sure there were things. Thank you. But I know he paid you. Silence. Not dramatic. Just silence. Then Kevin said, What? I know about the $1,800 a month. Another pause. That wasn't payment. What was it? Expenses. What expenses? Food, gas, stuff. Dad paid utilities. Well, yeah, because it's his house. He bought groceries. So did I. He paid your truck insurance. Kevin stopped talking. I continued. And your business insurance and tires and your phone. Allie, what are you doing? That question told me everything. Not what are you talking about? What are you doing? The problem wasn't the information. The problem was that I had it. I'm trying to understand Dad's finances. You have no right to go through his bank accounts. He gave them to me. He what? There it was. Actual fear. Not guilt. Fear. I stood at my kitchen island and looked through the window over the sink. Dad was in my backyard trying to tighten a loose screw on one of my patio chairs with a butter knife. I don't know why that detail stayed with me. Maybe because he looked like my dad again. Stubborn. Improvising. Convinced the correct tool was optional. Kevin said, "Put Dad on." No. Excuse me. You called me? I need to talk to him. Call his phone. He's not answering. I looked outside. Dad's phone was on the kitchen counter. I'll tell him you called. Ellie. What? Uh, Whoa. Don't pile on. I closed my eyes. Of course he said it. I almost laughed. Instead I said, I'm starting to think don't pile on has always meant don't make Kevin deal with consequences. That's ridiculous. Maybe. You've always thought you were better than me. No? Diet? Yes, you have. I thought I was responsible for you. That shut him up. Because it was true. I had helped Kevin too. That's the embarrassing part. Dad wasn't the only one. When Kevin was 26 and short on rent, I loaned him $900. When he was 31 and needed a deposit for an apartment, I paid it. When he started the shed business, I designed his first flyer for free and got him a discounted contractor through work. When his marriage fell apart, I drove 6 hours to help him move. Every time, I told myself that's what family did. And every time he recovered just enough to need another rescue later, I said, I don't think I'm better than you, Kevin. I think I spent too many years making sure you never had to find out what you could handle. He hung up. I shook for 20 minutes afterward. That's another thing nobody tells you about boundaries. Sometimes you say one calm sentence, and a phone call, and then stand in your kitchen feeling like you just robbed a bank. Dad came inside. Was that Kevin? Yep. Did. How'd it go? He hung up. Dad nodded slowly. Then he said he's under a lot of stress. I looked at him. Dad actually laughed. Yeah, I heard it. Heard what? May doing it again. That was the first moment I thought maybe he really understood. Not fully, but enough to hear himself. 3 days later, Dad asked me if we could drive to his house. He wanted clothes. More importantly, he wanted some papers from his bedroom. Kevin wasn't home. Dad still had a key. We drove to Nampa on a gray Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been inside the house in 2 months. The first thing I noticed was the garage. It used to be Dad's space. Pegboard on the walls. Hand tools. Fishing rods. My mother's old gardening shelves. Now half of it was stacked with Kevin's detailing equipment. Pressure washers. Chemical containers. Plastic bins. Boxes of towels. A large vinyl banner leaned against Dad's workbench. Benit Premier. Oh, detailing. Dad looked at it. He said he was renting a unit. Was he? For a while. Of course. Inside, the house looked tired. Not dirty. Neglected. There's a difference. A loose cabinet hinge. Burned out bulb over the sink. A stain on the dining room ceiling. Back door weather stripping. Coming loose. Small stuff. Stuff Kevin claimed he had moved in to manage. Dad walked slowly toward his bedroom. I followed. His closet had been reduced to about half its original space. Kevin's jackets were hanging on the other side. I stared at them. Dad noticed. He needed more room. There it was again. He needed. Dad opened a drawer and pulled out a small metal cash box. Inside were old photographs. My mother's wedding ring, 2 passports, and several envelopes. He gave me one. What's this? Read it at home. I almost laughed. Dad, I'm getting tired of surprise paperwork. I know. Does Kevin know about this? No. Is that why you wanted to come here? He sat on the edge of the bed. Then he said, Kevin wanted me to change the house. Change it how? Who gets it? I felt something in my chest tighten. Dad continued. He thought because he'd been living here and helping me, the house should go to him. I looked around the bedroom. Does it? No. Was it going to? Dad didn't answer quickly enough. Dad. I told him I'd think about it. I sat in the desk chair. Did you sign anything? No. You sure? Yes. Did he give you anything to sign? Dad nodded. What? Some papers. What papers? I don't know exactly. That's when I started getting uncomfortable. I stared at him. This was different. Why? He kept telling me it was just about making things easier later. Did you read them? Some. What did they say? That the house would pass to him. Then you did know what they were. I knew enough. Dad rubbed his palms together. He said you wouldn't care. That sentence hurt in a surprisingly childish place. He said that. Dad nodded. Said you had your own house. Good job. Retirement, all that. And what did you say? I said he was probably right. I looked away. There are moments when you realize the people you love have been discussing your needs in rooms you weren't in. And the conclusion they reached was that you didn't have any. That's a weird kind of grief. Dad said, I'm sorry. I nodded. I wasn't ready to make him feel better. We packed clothes. Then toiletries. Then Dad picked up the old blue suitcase Kevin had dropped on my porch. The suitcase had belonged to my mother. She bought it before a road trip to Yellowstone when Kevin and I were teenagers. The handle was scratched and one wheel squeaked. Mom refused to throw things away if they technically still worked. Dad rubbed his thumb over the faded luggage tag. Your mother used to overpack this thing so bad, I could barely lift it. I smiled despite myself. She packed 3 pairs of shoes for Yellowstone. 4. Dietaya. Why 4? She said she wanted options. I laughed. It was the first normal conversation we'd had in days. Then Dad said, Your mom worried about Kevin too. The smile disappeared. I know. I think I kept doing what we always did. I looked at him. Which was, assuming you'd be okay. That was probably the most honest sentence he gave me that entire month. On the way home, I opened the envelope at a stoplight. Not the whole thing, just enough to see the first page. It was a letter Dad had written. Not legal, not formal, just 3 pages in his handwriting. The first line said, Allie, I need you to know, Kevin didn't steal all of this from me. A lot of it, I gave him. That distinction mattered, because it would have been easier if Kevin were simply a thief. It would have been easier if Dad were simply a helpless old man being manipulated. But families are rarely that clean. Dad had made choices. Bad ones. Kevin had pressured him, yes. Kevin had also learned exactly what worked. Panic. Urgency. Shame. You know I'm trying. This is my last chance. I don't want Melissa thinking I'm a loser. If I lose the truck, I can't work. If I can't work, I can't help you. If I'm the one staying here, shouldn't the house eventually be mine? But Dad had said yes. Again and again. The letter explained why. When Kevin was 8, he had severe asthma. He missed school. Dad remembered sitting beside his hospital bed. When Kevin was 14, he got bullied badly enough that he transferred schools. When he was 19, he failed out of college and came home ashamed. Dad had built an entire emotional picture of Kevin as fragile. Someone one hard blow away from collapsing. And once you decide somebody is fragile, you can justify almost anything in the name of protecting them. I was different. I got good grades. I worked through college. I married young, divorced respectfully, kept my job, bought my own house. I rarely asked for money. Rarely asked for time. Rarely asked for anything. Dad wrote, every time you handled something well, I became more certain you didn't need me. I see now that I used your strength as an excuse. I read that sentence 3 times. It didn't make me forgive him instantly, but it was the first apology that actually named the injury. At the bottom of the last page, Dad had written, "Wah, I paid Kevin because I was afraid he would leave. I asked you for money because I knew you wouldn't. That one wrecked me, because there it was. I wasn't the trusted daughter. Not exactly. I was the predictable daughter. My reliability had become a resource, and everybody had been spending it. We got home around 6. I made soup. Dad ate at the kitchen counter. Halfway through dinner, he said, I could sell the house. I stopped eating. What? I've been thinking about it. Since when? Since before Kevin brought me here. Anonix? That surprised me. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't sure. What would you do? There are apartments near you. For seniors? He nodded. Independent living. Meals if you want them. Transportation. I knew the place. It was about 10 minutes away. Nice building. Not cheap, but not ridiculous either. Dad said, if I sell the house and pay the loan off, I'd be okay. What about Kevin? Dad looked at his soup. Exactly. Kevin had been living in that house as if the future had already been decided. The house wasn't just where he lived. It was his plan. Free housing now. Ownership later. Dad selling it would destroy the entire structure underneath Kevin's life. And suddenly I understood why my brother had dropped Dad at my house. Something had happened before that morning. Dad hadn't simply become more difficult to care for. Dad had started saying no. I asked him, what happened Friday night? He looked at me. The night before Kevin brought you here. Dad said nothing. What happened? He brought the papers up again. The house papers? Yes. And? I told him I wasn't signing. I sat very still. What did Kevin say? Dad looked embarrassed. He said, I'd wasted 3 years of his life. There it was. The title incident finally made sense. Kevin hadn't brought Dad to me because caring for him was too hard. He brought Dad to me because Dad had stopped being profitable. I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. Dad continued. He said, if I didn't trust him after everything he'd done, maybe I should stay with you for a while. Did you agree? I said maybe that was best. So he packed your suitcase. Dad nodded. King, how long did he give you? What? What? To pack. Dad, at the table. About 20 minutes. I felt something inside me go very calm. That's when I'm most dangerous, professionally speaking. Not when I'm yelling. When I stop. When the emotion gets organized. Dad said, don't hate him. I looked at him. I don't. And I meant it. I was furious. But hate would have made Kevin too simple. My brother wasn't some mastermind who woke up one morning and decided to exploit our father. He was a man who had spent decades being rescued until rescue started feeling like something he was owed. Dad helped teach him that. So did Mom. So did I. Not equally, but enough. The next morning, I called Kevin. We need to talk. He said, finally, I know why you brought Dad here. I already told you why. No. You told me you need a break? I do. You brought up the house Friday. Silence. Dad had warned me Kevin would deny it. He didn't. He said, so now Dad's telling stories. That's your response. He gets confused. That made me angry. Dad wasn't confused about Friday. You asked him to sign the house over to you. I asked him to make his wishes clear. Interesting wording. Oh, give me a break. No. That was all I said. No. It felt strange. Kevin waited. I think he expected more. An explanation. A defense. Something he could argue with. I said, Dad's considering selling. Kevin laughed. Actually laughed. No, he's not. Yes. He can't. He owns the house. He needs somewhere to live. He does. Where? Not your problem. Are you kidding me? Nope. Right. Allie, I live there. I know. My business equipment is there. I know. You can't just decide to sell Dad's house. I didn't. You're manipulating him. That almost impressed me. Kevin. What? You dropped him at my house and said, your turn. He said nothing. You don't get to abandon responsibility and keep authority. His voice changed. You've been waiting for this. For what? To take control. I almost responded. Then I remembered something I tell junior project managers all the time. Not every accusation requires a rebuttal. Sometimes answering nonsense gives it a dignity it hasn't earned. So I said, Dad will call you when he's ready. Then I hung up. Kevin called 6 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. He texted Dad. Then me. Then Dad again. At 9:30 that night, he sent. If Dad sells that house because of you, don't expect me to forgive you. I showed Dad. He read it twice, then placed my phone on the table. Sounds like him. You okay? No. That was another change. Old Dad would have said he was fine. Instead, he said no. I feel like I failed him. Kevin! Yes. I sat beside him. I think rescuing him every time may have failed him more than saying no. Now, Dad nodded. I know. Then he started crying, quietly. Not for money, not for the house, for his son. And shoes. That's what made everything harder. Dad loved Kevin. Kevin loved Dad too, in his own messy, entitled way. That didn't make what happened okay. But it meant there was no satisfying little box labeled villain where I could put him and move on. About 2 weeks later, Dad toured the senior apartment community. He loved it. That surprised both of us. He liked the wood shop. He liked that there was a shuttle to the grocery store. He liked a 78-year-old man named Warren, who had already invited him to a Monday poker game. Mostly, I think Dad liked seeing people his age living lives that didn't revolve around what their children needed. On the way back, he said, "I think I want to do it." "Then do it." He nodded. A mile later, he said, "There's something I want to offer you." I immediately got nervous. "What?" "The house." I looked over. Dad continued, "If I don't sell it..." "No, you don't even know what I'm saying. I have a pretty good idea." He frowned. "I could change things so it goes to you." "Dad. You've helped me more than anybody. That's exactly why I don't want it." He looked genuinely confused. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot because I didn't want to have this conversation while driving. Dad said, "It would make things right." "No, it wouldn't. I could talk to somebody, get everything changed. And Kevin, he doesn't have to know right now." There it was. The poisoned offer. Recognition. Ajay. The thing I had wanted my entire life. Dad was finally saying I was the dependable one, the trustworthy one, the one who deserved something. He's so unsure. It deserved something. And for about 5 minutes, I wanted it. I'm not proud of that. I pictured the house, Dad's workshop, Mom's kitchen, the apple tree in the backyard. I pictured Kevin finding out someday that the house came to me. There was a petty, wounded little part of me that thought, good. Let him know what it feels like. Then Dad said, "We just keep it between us until things settle down." And suddenly, I understood the price. Not money. Silence. Secrets. Protecting Kevin from reality. Again. Becoming the person who quietly carried the uncomfortable truth because everyone else was too fragile. Again. I looked at Dad. "No." He blinked. "What?" "I don't want the house." "Allie, sell it." "You sure?" "Yes." "You could have something." "I already have something." "What?" "My own house." He looked disappointed. That surprised me. Then I realized Dad wanted the gesture. He wanted to compensate, to fix the unfairness with an asset. But some things don't balance like that. I said, "If you want to make this right, stop making me responsible for what Kevin feels." Dad looked out the windshield. I continued, "Sell the house if that's best for you. Use the money for your life, your care, your apartment, travel, whatever." "Whatever. What about after?" "After what?" "When I'm gone." I reached over and squeezed his hand. "Dad, I don't need to be paid back for being your daughter." His eyes filled. "And I definitely don't want to be paid to keep another secret." He nodded. That was my internal finish line. Everything after that mattered. But that was when I changed. Dad listed the house 3 weeks later. Kevin found out before Dad could tell him. Of course he did. The realtor put a small "coming soon" sign in the yard. A neighbor texted him. Kevin called me from the driveway. I answered because at that point avoiding the conversation seemed worse. You listed the house? Dad did. Where am I supposed to go? I closed my eyes. There it was. Not. Where is Dad going? Where am I supposed to go? You'll need to figure that out. You know I put work into this place. So did Dad. I maintained it for 3 years. I thought about the loose hinge, the ceiling stain, the weather stripping. Some of it. Seriously, Kevin, I'm not doing this. I built my business around that garage. That was your choice. I was taking care of Dad. Dad was paying you. He offered. Then call it what it was. What? An arrangement. He went quiet. I continued. You got housing. You got money. Dad got help. That doesn't make you evil, but stop presenting it like you gave up your life for free. Kevin said, You've always hated me. I felt tired. Not angry. Tired. No. You have. I hated the job everybody gave me. What job? Cleaning up after whatever happened to you? He laughed bitterly. You think I asked for that? Sometimes? Yeah. That's bull. Maybe at first you didn't, but eventually you learned if things got bad enough, somebody would step in. Wow. Duh. And I learned if I stepped in fast enough, nobody would be mad at me. He stopped. That was the first time I said my part out loud. Not just Dad's. Not just Kevin's. Mine. I had participated. I had made myself useful, because useful felt safe. If I solved everybody's problems, nobody could accuse me of being selfish. If I never needed help, nobody could reject me. It worked. Until it didn't. Kevin said, quieter now. So, what do you want me to do? I almost laughed. Not because the question was funny, because it was the first honest question he'd asked. I want you to figure it out. That's it. That's it. I might lose the business. Then maybe the business doesn't work? He inhaled sharply. That's easy for you to say. No, it's just new for you to hear. He hung up. The house sold in January. Not for some ridiculous amount. This isn't that kind of story. Dad's neighborhood was nice, but it wasn't Beverly Hills. After the remaining loan balance and selling costs, he had enough to comfortably pay for his apartment and keep a solid reserve. That was the point. The money became Dad's life again. Not Kevin's rescue fund. Not my reimbursement. Dad's. The final family reckoning happened 3 days before closing. Dad wanted to walk through the house one last time. Kevin was supposed to have his things out. He didn't. Of course. When Dad and I arrived, Kevin's truck was in the driveway. The garage door was open. Half his business equipment was still inside. Dad stopped beside me. He said he'd be done. I looked at my watch. Closing's Friday. Dad nodded. Inside, Kevin was sitting at the dining table. There were papers spread in front of him. Not legal papers. Bills. Credit card statements. Business invoices. For the first time in years, my brother looked exactly like what he was. A scared, middle-aged man with no plan. Dad sat across from him. I stayed near the kitchen. Kevin looked at me. Can we have 5 minutes? Dad said, She stays. That surprised both of us. Kevin leaned back. Of course. Dad's voice stayed calm. Don't start. Kevin looked at him. You're selling my home. Dad said, It's my home. I've lived here 3 years. I know. I took care of you. I know. I put everything into being here. Dad's face changed. Not angry. Yet sad. I put everything into keeping you here. Kevin stopped. Dad's hands were trembling. I almost stepped in. Almost. Then I didn't. This wasn't mine to manage. Dad said, I paid you because I thought if I stopped, you'd leave. Kevin looked down. I would have helped you anyway. Dad waited. Kevin didn't look up. Dad said, would you? No answer. That was the strongest reaction in the room. No gasping. No shouting. Just a man, unable to answer his father. And Shipchiru Sabikonsipo. Asalan tu chu aksh salkermo. Kevin finally said, you offered me the money. I did. So why am I suddenly the bad guy? I didn't say you were. You're acting like it. Dad shook his head. I'm saying I was wrong too. Kevin looked confused. Dad continued. I kept fixing things for you because I thought that was love. He paused. And I kept asking Allison to absorb the cost because she made it easy. I felt my throat tighten. Kevin looked at me. Dad said, that wasn't fair to either of you. Kevin scoffed. How was giving me money unfair? Dad gave a tired smile. Look where you're sitting. Kevin stared at the bills in front of him. That landed. He didn't have a comeback. Dad continued. You're almost 50 years old and you're asking me where you're supposed to live. Kevin's face went red. I looked down. Hell. Dad said, that's partly on me. Kevin pushed his chair back. So what? You want me to thank you for cutting me off? No. Duh. Then, what do you want? Dad glanced at me. Then, back at Kevin. I want to stop being afraid of what happens if I say, no. That was it. That was the sentence. Not mine. Dad's. The room didn't erupt. Kevin didn't suddenly apologize. He stood, walked into the garage, threw something into a plastic bin harder than necessary, then came back. What about Allie? I looked up. What about her? Kevin pointed at me. She gets to come in at the end and be the hero? Dad started to respond. I said, no. Kevin stared at me. I am not the hero. You sure act like it. I spent years helping build this. He frowned. This. I gestured between the three of us. This whole setup. Kevin laughed. So now you're taking responsibility. For my part, I walked toward the table. I kept rescuing you because it made me feel useful. He looked surprised. I thought if I was useful, everybody would need me. And I confused being needed with being loved. Dad looked down. Kevin didn't say anything. I continued. So no, I'm not the hero. I'm just undoing my part. He looked at me for a long time. Then he sat back down. Must be nice. What? What? To just decide you're done. I shook my head. It's not nice. That was the truth. I miss you. His face changed. I hadn't planned to say that, but I did. I miss having a brother I could call without wondering what you needed. I miss Dad calling me without my stomach tightening because I thought something was going to cost $5,000. I miss believing everybody meant what they said. Kevin rubbed his face. I said, I'm not enjoying this. Nobody spoke. Then Dad said, neither am I. Kevin looked at him. Dad added, but that doesn't mean we go back. And we didn't. Kevin moved most of his equipment out by Thursday night. He left an old pressure washer and 3 plastic bins. I called him once. Not to rescue him. Not to negotiate. Just to tell him what remained. He picked everything up. Dad moved into his apartment the following week. He chose a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor with a ridiculous view of the parking lot and a sliver of the foothills if you leaned far enough to the left. He loved it. Within a month, he was losing money to Warren at poker. Every Monday, he joined a woodworking group. He started taking the shuttle to lunch once a week. And, maybe most importantly, he learned to ask for help without turning the request into a test of love. We still argue. He still occasionally starts a sentence with, "Kevin's having a hard time," then catches himself. Sometimes I let him finish. Sometimes I say, "I can listen, I'm not fixing it." That sentence has saved me a shocking amount of money. Kevin and I didn't speak for almost 2 months. Then, one Tuesday night, he texted, "Do you still know that guy who does commercial van wraps?" I stared at the message. Old me would have answered in 30 seconds. Then called the guy. Then negotiated the price. Then probably offered to proofread the design. I wrote, "Yeah." His number's on his website. Summit Wrap Company. Kevin replied, "Oh, that's it?" I smiled. "Yep." A minute later, "She cop, future water Suitcase." Okay. That was our first new conversation. Small. Yunyi. Airdigam Kratsa. Jiwa Tir Jiwan. And Tiwa Alf Thoughts to Card Tiwa. Boring. Healthy. Nyaturs. Nijal Hatti. Kevin eventually rented a bay behind an auto repair shop. His business shrank. Then weirdly, started doing better. Apparently overhead becomes easier to understand when your 75-year-old father isn't quietly paying half of it. He sold the expensive truck, bought a used van. He still complains. He's still Kevin. But 6 months after the house sold, he paid Dad $500. No occasion. No speech. Just a transfer. Dad called me immediately. "Kevin sent money." Good. You don't sound surprised. I'm trying not to make his progress my project. Dad laughed. Fair. To two. Then, a month later, Kevin asked if I wanted coffee. I almost said no. Instead, I went. We met at a place near my office. He looked older. So did I. Probably. For the first 10 minutes, we talked about nothing. Traffic. Dad. A football game. Then Kevin stirred his coffee for an absurd amount of time and said, "I was mad at you." "I notice. I thought you took Dad away." "I know." He kept stirring. Then I realized Dad couldn't come back. I waited. He didn't want to. There it was. I didn't soften it. "No, Jonathan." Kevin nodded. "I've been thinking about that. Probably worth doing." He gave me a look. I smiled. "I'm sorry." "No, you're not." "Not really." He laughed. It felt good. Then he said, "I did help him, you know." "I know. I wasn't just using him." "I know that too." That mattered. Because truth doesn't need exaggeration. Kevin did drive Dad to appointments. He did mow the lawn. He did cook. He did sit with him after a bad fall. He did keep him company after Mom died. People can love you and exploit you. People can care for you and resent you. People can be generous and entitled inside the same relationship. That's what makes family damage so hard to explain. Kevin looked at me. "I think I got used to somebody catching me." I nodded. "I got used to being the catcher." He smiled a little. "That sounds exhausting." It was. He looked down, then said, "Sorry." No speech. No tears. Just sorry. I said, "Me too." That's where we are now. Not healed. I don't even know what healed means for something like this. But different. Dad apologized to me again on my 47th birthday. A real apology. No explanation attached. He said, "I loved your independence so much, I stopped checking whether it hurt." I wrote that down later. Not because it erased anything. Because it was true. Huh? And truth had been in short supply. Almost a year after Kevin dropped Dad on my porch, I was cleaning out my hall closet when I found the blue suitcase. Dad had forgotten it. The same scratched suitcase Kevin rolled up my walkway that morning. The one with Mom's faded luggage tag. I called Dad. "You want your suitcase?" He said. "That old thing? Throw it out." I looked at it. One wheel still squeaked. The zipper caught near the corner. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I took it upstairs. 2 months later, my friend Natalie and I booked a 4-day trip to Santa Fe. Nothing dramatic. No life-changing pilgrimage. We ate too much. Bought pottery we didn't need. Walked around until our feet hurt. I packed in Mom's old suitcase. At the airport, the wheels squeaked all the way through the terminal. Natalie finally looked at me and said, "You know they sell luggage now, right?" I laughed. "I know. You emotionally attached to this thing." I thought about the morning it landed on my porch. Dad, standing behind it. Kevin saying, "Your turn." For years, that's how responsibility had arrived in my life. Somebody else carried something until they got tired. Then they handed it to me. My turn. My problem. My job. My bill. My mess to clean up. I looked at the suitcase and said, "Not exactly." Then I picked it up by the handle. The funny thing is, it felt lighter. Not because there was less inside. Because this time, I had packed it myself. And I was the one who had decided where I was going.